This meeting is being recorded.
Okay.
Hi everyone. I am really happy for this moment, actually, because I'd like to give actual public recognition to my husband, who has been my soulmate, my best friend, my partner in life, and really behind the scenes in helping everything that I do, whether for how many years editing my work, how many years supporting and giving me the green light to do what I've been doing, sharing me in so many different ways with my children, and letting me raise my children the way I felt I wanted to raise them. When I wanted to homeschool, we homeschooled. When I wanted to nurse on demand, all the different things that sometimes can get in the way of relationships when so just no words and definitely no way to capture the deep appreciation that I've had for my husband, letting me do what I could do best, and that was to be the mother that I wanted to be. And every which way in my journeys, and I've switched from wanting to do this and wanting to do that, and Baruch Hashem, it's always been him giving my back, whether it was financially supporting the projects. We had a children's museum for 15 years, practically in Israel, and just, one thank you for everything. And I thought during the 3 weeks, what better time to start to work on the foundation of everyone's home, so that God willing, please God, as we work through each and every one of our homes and elevating them to that next new height, that we'll be able to very soon see the ultimate home, our Beit HaMikdash in Yerushalayim with Mashiach. So I do a lot of the talking. Today I'm just really going to let my husband share his wisdom. Every time people have come to my home for Shabbos, they are blown away how he speaks. Every time we've done Shabbatons together, people are speechless. So I felt like this is a good way for both of us to do the Shabbatons on the road, on a Zoom, instead of really on the road.
Thank you, sweetheart. So it's always dangerous to follow that kind of introduction, because I'm not sure I could ever live up to it. And we thought that it would be an important opportunity, given the 3 weeks, and given the idea that the Chorban and the Geul are connected to the marriage between the Eibishter, Hashem, and the Jewish people. The Eibishter is the Chosen, the groom, and the Jewish people, Knesset Yisrael, as the Kala. This is our inaugural podcast, as it were, and we haven't even talked about what we're going to talk about. So there's been no rehearsal of any type. So you'll forgive us if it's more like a Shabbos Tish or an afternoon at our table having a conversation, or at least listening in on our conversation. It's in the middle of the day, so it will not be elongated, but we hope to come back on a weekly basis on Tuesdays at noon California time. So I wanted to kind of start with basics when it comes to a relationship, and especially the relationship between a husband and wife. Now, just so everyone can understand the context from which I speak, and I think we speak. We've been married for now 33 years, coming up on our conclusion of our 33rd year. We've raised 2 wonderful adult children, one who just recently was married to a wonderful young lady, and have just given us our first grandchild, Yisrael Avram. I refer to him as Shruli. Wonderful little blessing. And our daughter, who's 22, and God willing, we'll find her B'Shert Techel Miyad, and also begin her family. Our relationship, like all relationships, has gone through a growth process. From the day we first met to the third date of our shidduch, where I asked my wife to marry me, to having children, to raising them, to being, as it were, empty nesters, never completely empty nesters, and going through the growth that two individuals grow through, both as individuals and as a unit. So there's always going to be, unless you're a tzaddik gomer, a perfect tzaddik, perfect righteous person, and your spouse is a tzaddik gomer, your spouse is a perfectly righteous person, there's going to be moments in which, and times of stress and strain, times of frustration, even, God forbid, times of anger. You hope those are short and easily moved beyond. But those are the natural aspects of the give and take of a relationship. And what I hope to discuss is something that I found in sitting and learning in Tzemach Tzedek many years ago in the old city of Yerushalayim, and learning Hasidus from Reb Chaim Shalom Deitch, who was for many, many years while I was at Tzemach Tzedek a friend and a mentor in Hasidic understanding. I marry those lessons in Hasidus in terms of the husband and wife, no pun intended, to what my wife teaches as she counsels couples and families, and simply in teaching Hasidus. If you've read any of her Reaching New Heights books, especially the one on marriage, you see this concept articulated there. The fundamental concept is that the wife, as the Akeres Habayit, the foundation of the homemaker, she sets the spiritual and emotional stage for the family. Now, it's interesting, and in English we call the Akeres Habayis the homemaker, and that's almost a pejorative term in the modern world. But if you think about it, the person who makes the homemaker. And so oftentimes when couples are struggling, whether because the husband doesn't seem to be living up to his responsibilities, and as a result the wife is short and lacks patience for her husband, and the children suffer, v'chule, etc., or any number of relationship issues, my wife is oftentimes counseling the wife that she can elevate her husband and bring him to levels that he might not even appreciate. So I'm going to throw it back to my wife to talk a little bit about that, because what I want to do is then pivot back to the Kabbalistic and Hasidic understanding of where that power comes from. Because I think that if we can understand the theory, and by theory I mean the Kabbalistic beginning, the mystical understandings of the spheres and the Zohar and the Nekeva, the male and the female aspects of the relationship, and how holiness flows, how it flows down, how it flows back up. And then, as Hasidus is wont to do, Hasidus takes the pure theory of Kabbalah and grafts it to praxis, to the practical behavior. How you take the theory of Kabbalah, the mystical notions of the spheres and the worlds and the flow of energy, the divine flow, and how do you make that practical? How do you bring it into your life so it makes any sense other than to a makubal, to a Kabbalist, a mystical rabbi sitting somewhere in Yerushalayim, floating in the never lands, as it were. And then from that we'll come back to the practical aspects. So I'm going to throw it back to my wife and ask her to explain this idea at the very practical level of how the wife how she literally makes the home.
First of all, anytime you see fire, you don't want to put gasoline on it. So many times we can see the other, whether it's our spouse or our children, they're on fire. They have that moment of being angry or not in a good place or very self-absorbed because of what they're going through in life. Could be just really the stress of the day and their inability to really see through the moment. So first step, very practical, if you see fire, you don't put gasoline on it. So that we don't exacerbate the situation. And definitely, I always tell people that to really be a master of the mouth is the most important key aspect. Because when you can hold yourself back and not get triggered and not, respond in a way that will just exacerbate the situation, I think that's first rule. When you do that, and when you get in the habit of bringing more peace in that way, the Shekhinah rests in your home. Because if there's arguments, the Shekhinah can't rest. And if the Shekhinah can't rest in your home, then the extra help you need to bring out to take out the fire just leaves. And from a deep Kabbalistic explanation, the reason why is that there's a word for Shekhinah. And that terminology, it's actually a few words, is Esh Ochelet Esh, which means the holy fire of the Shekhinah will eat up, Ochelet, the unholy fire of the other. So that when you create space to say, I want to make peace here, whether I'm right or they're wrong, I'm just going to really keep quiet, let the flames flare out on its own, and then the Shekhinah comes and actually whatever smoldering fire that's left there, day by day, that power of that godly energy does the work rather than you yourself having to do the work.
So from the practical counselor's point of view, when you're talking to a couple individually or together, why does how does the ultimate responsibility tend to fall on the wife as opposed to the husband?
So, like a woman takes the seed of the man and she brings out his seed, she takes that seed and develops it for 9 months. So Kabbalah teaches us that women actually come down into this earth to develop the seed of her man, not just the offsprings, but his whole being. So when she is his cheerleader, when she has faith in him, when she's at peace with his process of becoming, just like she's going to work on herself to be at peace with her process of becoming more actualized and more, refined, then she has the power to give him the strength to believe in himself. Because if she doesn't believe in him, and she's throwing arrows and pointing fingers of you're not good enough for me, you're not doing this for me, you're always away from me, you always close the door on me, then he feels lower self-esteem, he feels broken, maybe even more than before, and then she's lost the opportunity to bring out that potential in him, just like she's been gifted with a womb to bring out the potential of his seed and future offspring. The same thing goes by the development of her husband's potential.
Okay, so now what I'd like to do is talk about that in the context of the husband-wife relationship, flowing from Kabbalah into Hasidus and into the practical. So if we start with some basic concepts. That there is in Kabbalah this notion that the divine flow flows through spheres. Now, you're never going to find a physical sphere. It doesn't exist in our world in a physical way. It exists in the concept of the Torah speaks in the language of men, writ large, so that we can understand and relate to how the divine flow, this transcendency, goes from the infinite, where there is no connection to the finite or physical world, down into a physical world. So the divine flow, which flows through different worlds, right? And we know that there's Atzilus, and even above Atzilus, there's Keser, and from Atzilus, and I'm not going to explain what each of these are this week, but we'll get into them at some point in our podcast. And from Atzilus to Bria, to the level of creation, Atzilus you can understand as kind of the potential for reality. And Bria is where there's creation, and Yetzirah is where there begins to be formation, an actual thing around the created being, and Asiya, the world of action. But within those worlds, the divine flow flows through a tripartite architecture that has the form of a person. So that at the very top you have Chokhmah, wisdom, and then that's on the right side, the kind side, the Chesed side. And then you have Bina, which is understanding, which is on the left side, the stricter side. And then you have Da'as, which is the bottom part of the triangle, the Segel, Chokhmah, Bina, and Da'as. And those are the intellectual aspects of this divine flow. And it forms the face, at least the upper face. Now there is also a higher level, which is Keser, which means crown, and that flows above in a kind of surrounding way, the way a crown does. And from Chokhmah, Bina, and Das, and Das is knowledge. So if we were to talk about this, Chokhmah, which is wisdom, is actually, as according to Kabbalah, made up of two words, Koach Ma. Koach being potential, and Ma being what? The what potential? It's the kind of wisdom that comes from what we would call a priori knowledge. It's not something that you learn by experience. It flows to you. That's chokhmah, that's wisdom. And if you were to explain it in practical terms, it's that wisdom that comes, that creative wisdom that comes to the composer of music, where he or she just hears the music in his or her mind's eye and then starts to write it down. It's when that first thought comes in its pristine form, the mathematician who's looking to solve a mathematical problem in algebra or calculus, and the answer just flows to him or her. The poet, that kind of inspiration, that's chokhmah. Bina, or understanding, is the level at which that first creative thought begins to take fashion or form. It's where you begin to take that creative thought and speak about it, articulate it, write about it, try to understand it, peel it back, build something that's useful from it. Because when the composer of music begins to just have that creative thought and hears the music in his or her mind's eye, it's worthless to anyone else. Indeed, after that moment passes, it's even worthless to the composer. He or she must sit and write it down, start scribbling the musical notes on a piece of paper, or try to remember the music in a more concrete fashion, even if not written down. That's the process of understanding of Bina. And Bina can progress to the point of an architectural drawing with all the details to build out an entire building, Bina, understanding, which is related to the Hebrew word of binyan, of actual building. And then da'as, which is the bottom part of the segel, which we would see here in the lower part of the face, is the idea of actual knowledge, of an understanding at a very practical level. Think of da'as as kind of the engineer. Some creative person had an idea of a building. An architect designs it with all the architectural drawings, so you have the first thought of what this building should be, the creative thought, the chokhmah. Then the architect takes that creative thought, maybe having talked to the person, the developer who wants to build the building, and he creates the drawings. That's the bina. And then the engineer, the da'as, he takes these two notions and actually builds out with all the technical details so that the construction can take place, the building. That's the das, the moment in which intellectual creativity and understanding, chokhmah and bina, are actualized in practice. Now, the husband in a relationship represents this chokhmah. It doesn't mean that men are gifted with creativity and the woman who is the bina only has the understanding, but we're talking about a divine flow. And we're talking about the emphasis. And so if we were to understand where the man and the woman sit in this divine flow, from the perspective of what my wife was talking about, the man of the home, as the king of the castle, as it were, represents chokhmah. The pasuk, the Hasidus, Kabbalah and Hasidus utilize to talk about this concept is in Mishlei, or Proverbs, by Shlomo HaMelech, King Solomon, who wrote, Eishes Chayu, a woman of valor, Ateres Bailo, is the crown of her husband. So we're going to keep that pasuk in mind to understand where the two sit, because initially we talk about the king of the house, the balabayas, the master of the home, the chokhmah, the koachma, that's the husband. The woman as bina, she as understanding receives the flow from her husband. But the only way that the flow moves, and remember the flow has to come down into the husband as the chokhmah, he has to have that a priori experience. So divine flow comes from above, and it comes from the ateres, from the keser, from the crown. We'll come back to the crown momentarily, but it has to flow down through the crown into the husband. And the only way it can flow down into the husband as chokhmah is if he is koachma, if he is absolutely bittul, self-abnegation, nullified to anything but the divine flow. If the husband is able to nullify himself in that way so that he can receive the divine flow, then from that creative moment where he receives the light that's going to sustain his family, it flows through him as we say in Chochmah is simply a nekudah, a point. It's like the dot of the yud. The yud is simply a dot that has a little kotz above and a kotz below, a little thorn above and a little tail below. That thorn above is the flow into the dot, which is nothing. It's simply a dot. And then it flows down. And where does it flow? It flows into his wife, who is Bina, understanding. The chokhmah from the husband is worthless except at the moment of that experience of chokhmah. It doesn't have any form. It has no substance. It has no sustenance. The husband in and of himself can't do anything other than experience bittul to the Eibishter, to the divine flow, and receive that. Then it flows to the wife. But how does it flow into Bina? How does Chokhmah, this dot, this divine flow that Bina doesn't receive directly, because Bina has no kli, has no vessel to receive the divine flow directly at this level. The ateres, the crown, is over the chokhmah. Eishes chayo ateres baila. It's a crown for the ba'ala, for her husband. This flow is able to go into Bina when the wife is absolutely bittul, self-abnegation to her husband. Now that might strike many in the modern world as reprehensible. What kind of talk is that? That the wife should be nullified to her husband so she can receive the divine flow. But if that's the response, you've missed the initial self-abnegation, the initial bittul. The initial bittul has got to be the husband. If the husband is not bittul to the Eibishter, to the absolute divine flow, if he's not able to remove his ego from this three-party relationship, God, the husband, and the wife, then he doesn't receive any flow whatsoever. And if he doesn't recognize that this divine flow, he adds nothing real to it. He's simply a vessel to receive it and give it to his wife. If he recognizes that his wife becomes the bina, the understanding, the sustenance, the substance of that divine flow, if he realizes that and she's able to understand this notion and be bittul to her husband in that way, then she receives the divine flow. And the woman as bina creates the binyan, the building of the relationship. She creates the foundation. She's the architect. She draws out what's this house, what this home, what this family, what this relationship is going to look like and feel like to all the participants. A man who comes home and expects his slippers and his newspaper and his cup of tea and a subservient wife, that's not the relationship we're talking about. The husband who comes home and has a sefer open of Gemara or Mishnah or Torah and Rashi or Chitas, Hasidic teachings, that man who comes home to those things and is bittul to that notion, that his role and his responsibility is to allow the divine flow to flow into him and out. That man is worth being bittul to from the wife, because it's not a matter of a subservience. Bittul, self-abnegation to the Eibishter or a wife to the husband, is not subservience. It's an openness by removing one's own ego and taivas appetites so that that flow flows through. As the woman is building on this divine flow and creating this architecture for the home, for the relationship, because there's now this union between the male and the female. Adam Yoda Chava, as it says in Parshas Bereshis and Genesis, Adam knows Eve in the biblical sense, and she creates children. And as my wife talked about earlier, the children that flow from this union gestate within her for 9 months, not within the husband. The husband's responsibility is unique, but very cabined. It's a discrete role to be absolutely bittul to the Eibishter, so that the wife can look upon her husband as someone to respect, as someone to be bittul to in that concept. Not the man who wants his slippers and his newspaper and his cup of tea, but the man who wants to be able to sit down and open up a sefer, a holy book, and learn Torah for Torah's sake. Not to be a tzaddik, not to be a Talmid Chacham, not to be the king of the house, but simply l'shem shamayim. That flow through the wife then over time creates the children, the toldos, the generations that come, both literally in our children, but figuratively in this divine flow, mythically, mystically. A myth, by the way, is not a falsehood. A myth is an articulation of a transcendent truth that needs, because the Torah speaks in the language of men, writ large, needs some physical notions to it. But it's something that is without physical characteristics whatsoever. So these children that the wife creates, both literally, physically, children, but spiritually, the divine flow that leaves her then creates the flow below. So we had Chochmah, Bina, and Das. Now we have Chesed, Gevurah, Tiferes, another upside down triangle, another segel, 3 dots. Chesed being kindness, Gevurah, the strictness, Tiferes, the beauty that comes from kindness and strictness together, a beauty. And then ultimately, and that represents, we talked about again the figure of the man. So we had the intellect, Chochmah, Bina, and Das. Now we have the main part of the body, the Chesed, Gevurah, Tiferes. And then we have the trunk, Netzach, Hod, Yesod. Netzach being, let's go back and translate. Chesed, kindness, Gevurah, strictness, Tiferes, beauty. And then Netzach, Hod, Yesod. Netzach, the trunk on the right side, being permanence. Hod being majesty. Yesod being a foundation. And then finally at the base, Malchus. Those create the children, the emotions of the family. Now, once that divine flow from the husband to the wife to the children, both in this mystical way and in the physical world, the wife relates to the children principally because the flow is moving this way, down. That flow, when it reaches Malchus, which has no characteristic of itself, it simply receives from above and is the mashpia, the influencer below. Once it reaches that level, the light then is reflected back up, called the Or Choser. Now the Or Choser is not the same light that came to the husband and flowed through the wife and down to the children of Chesed, Gevurah, Tiferes, Netzach, Hod, Yesod, because it has gone through these emanations, each one adding and changing it slightly. The flow from the husband was pretty pristine. Chokhmah is koach ma. It doesn't do a whole lot with the light. But the wife, the mother, she built into something. Ad kedei kach, to the extent that she actually created children, these emotions, and these real children. The light then flows back up, and in its flow back up, as it's returning to its source, it more or less returns in an altered and higher state, to the point where it's able, when it flows back through the keser, the ateros of the husband, it returns to a higher level because it's been elevated through this process. It's been modified. And then the process starts again. But this time the husband's light, this bittul to the divine flow, doesn't start at the ateros that was. His crown is now higher because the Or Choser changed and was elevated. And we started again. But this time it's a higher light. So the light that flows to him is higher. Back to the woman who creates a better building, a deeper building, a more important building, a more profound building. And the children are now older. The children that are created from that are more mature. So that the light as it goes through is elevated even more so. And there's another Or Choser, another returning light. Or Choser being the light of reflection, or reflective light, or returning light. And now it flows back, and it's at even a higher level. The crown over the husband's head is at a higher level. And so the light that flows back a third time and a fourth time is elevated and elevated. And that's the experience you have. Anyone who's been in a relationship, and uniquely we're talking about the husband, wife, and family relationship, knows that what they experience at the 33rd year cannot be compared to what they experienced even on the day they met and fell in love, if they did. Or after the Shana Rishona, the first year, where things were all new and fresh and you got used to one another and you developed habits and patterns. And then you had the children and you had whatever experiences you've had, good, not so good, or indifferent. Whatever those are, as they go through this process of divine flow, every year, every process, and it's not a yearly flow, of course. We're talking about a divine flow. It's kol rega v'rega, kol every single moment. But over time, it's deeper and more profound. The connection that my wife and I have after 33 years, and 2 children, and now a grandchild, and God willing, many more to come, simply can't be compared. Ein aroch, as we say. There's no comparison between what we have now and what we had 30 some odd years ago. We couldn't have done this podcast 30 some odd years ago, because we've learned and experienced so much. Now keep in mind, on the Or Choser, the flow returns in reverse. So the husband, with the Or Choser, recognizing the mother, the Em, his wife, as the mother and creator of the children, and he receives the flow from her. And in that context, as the mother of his children, he's bittul to her, to be able to receive that flow in reverse. So this concept of bittul works both ways. A husband has to learn that when it comes to his wife as the mother of the toldos, of the children, he has to be bittul to her. Now we return to the Ateres Abayla. So we know the concept in Hasidus is that in today's chuppah, the wife circles the husband 7 times under the chuppah. In Lasud Lavo, in the time to come, when Mashiach redeems us from this galus, the husband will in fact circle the wife. There's a deep mystical concept there about the reversal of roles. But just understand this, in this world, because we're talking about the relations we have in this world, the Eishes Chayo Ateres Bible, remember we talked about the flow into the husband as Chokhmah? Well, the wife not only serves as Bina next to him as part of that flow, but she serves as his crown. Now, many Meforshim, and there's many Meforshim on the Pasuk from Mishlei, and the actual Pasuk says that the woman is the crown of her husband, a good woman, an Eishes Chayo, a righteous woman, a woman of valor, but a bad woman is like a worm that eats his bones. Chassidus focuses on the first part, which is that divine flow, that crown is an encompassing light. And as we know in Kabbalah and in Chassidus, there are two types of energy flow. There's a pneumius, an inward, a kav, a line of divine flow, and then there's a misaviv, there's a external or surrounding flow, and a soiviv, we call it, or mimale, that's the inside, the inner flow that fills from inside, and there's an or soivev, a surrounding. The ateres provides the source for the divine flow into the husband as an encompassing light. There's also a flow from inward, but that will be for another topic. So if I were to throw it back to my wife and say, given these Kabbalistic, mystical, and Hasidic understandings of the divine flow, how does that relate to specific couples and counseling in terms of how they deal with their relationship, husband to wife and wife to husband, and both to the children?
Before we even address that, as I was hearing you speak so beautifully, all these concepts, and so easily, and it was just flowing, Baruch Hashem, you had a gift of speech, and I bless you to continue sharing your knowledge and forevermore.
Amen. Kol mivorechet misborechet.
I think like most situations of those calls that come my way, especially when the woman's calling me, they would say, but my husband isn't so bittul to the Eibishter. My husband is not so in the flow. And I would say that women have the power to arouse that flow, in a sense that there's a beautiful pasuk that says that, you know, a woman has the power to create her husband's will. Again, back to when I was beginning my conversations here, and an explanation of creating their flow is not being antagonistic, not being aggressively demanding, not being so needy and making them feel lower than because they're not supplying you with your needs. Because the more you pick on them, the more you point out their weaknesses, the more they retreat and the more they won't have that will to be connected to Hashem. So I think that's the first most important crucial factor, because if we go back to the time of Adam and Chava, we're really rectifying their challenge and their relationship. And the explanation of what happened back then that caused Chava to like so easily betray herself and give in to taking that apple against God's will was because the husband, Adam, was basically having a challenge in his being created. He felt insecure we're taught that he just felt like he's not really, being the master of his world. And he was so busy in his low self-esteem, as it were, that he didn't really converse with his wife. He didn't really explain to her the law that God commanded him to explain, because he was so busy with his own, I guess, depression, you might say. And she actually took it personally. She felt lonely and broken, and was enticed to have conversation with the snake because her husband wasn't having conversation with her. And then the snake then entices her to go toward the material to find some peace and joy in life. So it's very easy for the wife to feel broken, rejected, hurt, when her husband doesn't have that yet. He doesn't really have that wherewithal to be bittul to Hashem, because that's a life's journey. So already lechatchila, from the beginning, she has to be aware of that, and not like look down at him that he's not giving the flow to her, because it's not going to happen. The Lubavitcher Rebbe actually says that women light the Shabbos candles because women have the power to bring out the light in the other. So if he doesn't have that will to begin with, and she's waiting there like desperate to get his attention, to get him to daven with a minyan, or to get him to learn, or to get him to be more kind to the children and not as harsh, then she won't then have the power to turn on his light so that he could be bittul to the Eibishter, so she could receive.
Right, so let me jump in then and reconnect it to the Mishrei, Pasuk and Mishrei that we've been talking about. Eishes Chayla Teres Baila. And for those who'd like to know, it's Perek Yud Beis Pasuk Dalet, the 12th chapter, 4th verse. Eishes Chayil, the woman of valor, Ateres Baila, is the crown for her husband. So if you recall the divine flow, after the divine flow into the husband, who's bittul, in it we talked about the flow into Bina, Das, L'chule, etc. But remember what we came back to. The Pasuk says that the woman is the Ateres. She starts the flow. What my wife is saying, if I may be so bold, is the wife is a crown. She is the source of the divine flow for her husband. Now, irrespective of whether or not the husband wears the crown very well or leverages the crown very well, she has an independent role as the crown. And so that her understanding of her role, not as Bina, but as the Ateres, as the crown above her husband, is to provide that flow.
Exactly.
And so, irrespective of what he does with it, she's still a crown. She still has the jewels. My wife points out, as the Rebbe said, over again, and continues to teach us that the Geula will be in the schus and the merit of the women, just like it was when we left Egypt. As we know, the future redemption is always likened and sourced in that first Geula from Mitzrayim, Metzias Mitzrayim. And we were redeemed from Egypt in the merit of the women then, and we will be redeemed in the future. And what does that mean? It means the woman understands this role. And this role stands independent of her husband. She's still a crown. Even if he's nothing more than a thorn, she's still a crown. And what my wife has taught me, and I think many others, is that if she's truly a crown and can rise to that level and that patience, because a crown simply sits on the husband's head comfortably. It doesn't move. It exercises no other value other than to be the vessel for that flow. And if she does that, the man who is still a zocher, still a yid, still has the etzem atzmus of the Eibishter, that flow will have an impact. And it might not be immediate, and it might not be what the woman wants exactly, but over time, because keep in mind what happens if there's just a little flow, not what she wants. He's not truly dedicated to being totally bittul, to receive all of her flow, but a little. So then it flows, and it goes to her when she's then bittul to her husband at the level of bina. Remember, as a terrorist, she's on top. But at the level of bina, she's now bittul to that flow. And it would probably be more exact to say she's not bittul to her husband, she's bittul to the flow. And she receives it and builds it, and then there's that or choser. And that's going to elevate both of them and their children, so that the next time this flow comes down, the husband is elevated. And it might be imperceptibly greater. It might be at the margins. But over time, this flow, and remember, it's not a daily thing, an hourly thing, a weekly thing. This flow is continual. And there's, as we know in the world, and as we know through Chassidus, there's a halach v'shol, there's a waxing and a waning. There's an ebb and a flow. You know, give and take. There are days when things are all hitting on all cylinders and days when they're not. But the flow ultimately has a momentum. And if we're open to that momentum, if we allow it, and of course, part of the counseling that my wife gives is to teach the husband this notion that he has a part to play. And while the woman is both the Ateris and the Bina, and the M for the Toldos, the mother for the generations that come, the reality is the husband has a role to play. And his role is important, as we would say, imminent, but ultimately, the woman, as it were, is a, what is the term I'm looking for? Bookends for her husband's growth. She's both the Ateris and the outlet for that divine flow. She's the kli, the recipient of her husband's divine flow.
It's very hard sometimes for women because they sometimes have had such difficult relationships with their own father and their own childhood experiences, and they like get married and they think, oh my gosh, finally someone loves me, someone is going to like make me feel like a somebody, and then the husband themselves just aren't at that place to be a support. And I always tell women, you know, and it's something to really think about. When we were up in Shemayim, we had everything, and like we had all of what our soul needed. We were basking in the glory of Hashem, near the Kisei HaKavod, and like some souls wait 800 years to fulfill and be chosen to fulfill a mission like this. And to really realize that we're chosen to do this is the reason for our being. And the more we accept that mission of being the giver of love, the giver of acceptance, the giver of compassion for the other in their journeys, the more we fulfill that mission and take great pride and great honor to be able to be less needy of the other. And with time, though, Baruch Hashem, the blessings do flow back, and you do get all that you wanted. But it takes a little letting go, and then it finally does come around. And I bless everyone for the opportunity to really tap into the mission statement of why you're here on this earth and rise above.
Well, it's been an hour, and I appreciate the hour we got to spend together. We don't always get so much time during the week.
For that reason alone, Diana, we should do this.
And Bezrat Hashem, God willing, in the future podcast, we can talk about this idea of the mashpia, of the one who gives, and the one who receives, and how that works in Hasidic terms.
Thank you for joining. And next time we'll leave time for questions, or you'll go and I'll see who, because usually we end with questions and stuff like that. But
So-
you have to go?
Yeah.
Okay, so then I'll see if there's any questions here on Facebook. And if you can turn on that light, because...
I'm going to have to close out
Oh,
Zoom.
here. Okay, so I'll just take the questions from Facebook, and we'll meet again next week. Hopefully, please God, Tuesday, 12 Pacific time, and 3 o'clock New York time.
Yom Tov.
Bye. Very nice. Okay, we're still live here. Let me see if I can get this a little closer so I can see the questions. Yeah, all right. Thank you for joining. That was very enlightening. Yay! All right, so if there's any questions here, please post. Otherwise, I'm going to wish you all a beautiful day and looking forward to tomorrow's gathering with Orit Esther Ryder in preparation for our getaway. Blessings. Thank you for joining. See you later.